It was supposed to be a quiet evening in a picture-perfect neighborhood, but in seconds it turned into a nightmare. A black Navy veteran's wife stepped outside their home, only to be confronted by men who claimed to be HOA security. What happened next was unthinkable. In front of stunned neighbors, one of them slapped her, not realizing who her husband truly was. Because this wasn't just any man. This was a highly trained Navy SEAL, and what followed would shake the entire community to its core. The Callens had worked their entire lives for the dream of peace. Andre Callen, a decorated Navy SEAL who had served tours overseas, carried with him the scars, both visible and invisible, of years spent protecting his country. All he wanted now was normalcy, a quiet home, a safe community, and a fresh start, with his wife Denise. They had chosen a well-manicured suburban neighborhood governed by a strict homeowners association, believing it would guarantee safety and order. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. White picket fences lined the streets, kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, and neighbors waved as though nothing bad could ever happen there. But beneath the polished surface, tension simmered. Denise, a warm and gentle woman, quickly noticed the cold stares she received whenever she walked alone. Whispered comments followed her in the grocery store. Doors seemed to close a little faster when she passed by. Andre dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the usual adjustment of moving into a new place. But Denise knew better. She could feel it, the subtle hostility, the unspoken message that they didn't belong. The HOA board, led by a handful of self-important residents, seemed especially watchful. They made comments about their property standards and issued notices for trivial things no one else was ever cited for. Still, Andre and Denise tried to rise above it, choosing kindness over confrontation. They focused on building their home, making friends where they could, and ignoring the petty rules. But the truth was clear. This wasn't just about rules. It was about something far uglier, simmering just beneath the surface. And one evening, when Denise stepped outside, that ugliness came crashing out into the open, disguised as authority, wearing badges that weren't real. The Callens had been in their home for only 6 months when the so-called notices from the HOA began to pile up. A lawn that was too long by less than half an inch. A trash bin left visible for 5 minutes past pickup. Even a small potted plant Denise placed on their porch was flagged for being unsightly. At first, Andre shrugged it off, knowing how neighborhood associations thrived on power games. But for Denise, each warning felt like a targeted strike, meant to remind them they were being watched. Soon things escalated beyond petty letters. Anonymous complaints appeared about noise when Denise played soft gospel music indoors. Strangers snapped photos of their home from the sidewalk, pretending it was for HOA records. Then came the worst. A neighbor whispered to Denise that the board had been grumbling about how people like them lowered property values. Andre's training had taught him patience, discipline, and restraint, but it also sharpened his awareness. He recognized patterns, how harassment always escalates if unchecked. He began keeping a quiet eye out, logging every notice and photographing every petty violation issued. Deep down, he suspected this was more than just HOA politics. It was prejudice with a badge of authority, thinly veiled as community rules. One late afternoon, Denise stepped outside to check the mail. That's when it happened. A black SUV with flashing yellow lights pulled into their driveway. 2 men emerged wearing dark uniforms with patches that read, HOA Enforcement. They weren't police officers, but their demeanor screamed authority. Neighbors began peeking from behind curtains as the men confronted Denise. They accused her of ignoring HOA mandates, speaking over her protests as if she were invisible. Denise tried to explain, her voice trembling, but one of the men shoved a violation notice into her hand. When she refused to sign it, saying she needed her husband present, the man's expression twisted, and then, in front of stunned onlookers, he slapped her across the face. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Denise stumbled, clutching, her cheek, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, time froze. Neighbors gasped, some even recording on their phones. But no one stepped forward. What the men didn't realize was that Andre was already home. He had been inside, quietly reviewing files on his computer when the sound reached him. In an instant, his instincts took over. The man they had thought was just another neighbor was, in fact, a Navy SEAL, a warrior forged in some of the harshest environments on Earth. And the sight of his wife being struck would awaken a side of him the HOA bullies never imagined existed. Andre was out the front door before the neighbors even registered movement. Years of military training had honed his body into a weapon of precision, but this wasn't about combat drills or orders. This was about his wife. He saw the red mark blooming on Denise's cheek, her trembling frame trying to steady itself, and something inside him snapped. The two so-called HOA enforcers didn't even have time to react before Andre closed the distance. He moved with speed and control only a SEAL could possess. In one fluid motion, he wrenched the first man's wrist, spinning him sideways and sending the forged badge clattering to the ground. The man screamed, his arm twisted into a position. That made escape impossible. The second man lunged forward, but Andre was faster. He pivoted, his fist striking with pinpoint precision. Not wild anger, but controlled force. The blow knocked the man backward into the hood of his own SUV. The neighbors gasped. Phones were raised higher, recording every second. For once, the so-called authority figures weren't in control. Denise called his name, her voice shaking, afraid he might lose himself in the fury. But Andre didn't. He held back from unleashing the full extent of what he was capable of. Instead, he pinned both men down, his voice booming, not with rage, but with deadly calm authority. These men are not law. They're frauds. And they just assaulted my wife. The weight of his words echoed across the street. Neighbors looked at each other, realizing what they had just witnessed wasn't some minor dispute. It was criminal assault. The bravado drained from the fake officers' faces as their act crumbled. Their uniforms, their fake badges, their false power, all of it was nothing against a man who had stared down real enemies on foreign soil. Within minutes, real police sirens wailed in the distance. The so-called HOA cops were handcuffed and shoved into the back of patrol cars, their lies unraveling with every passing second. And in that moment, standing beside his shaken but unbroken wife, Andre Callan made it clear. No one, no neighbor, no board, no imposter with a fake badge would ever lay a hand on his family again. When the real police arrived, the street looked like a movie set. Flashing lights bouncing off car windows, neighbors gathered in stunned silence, and two fake HOA officers, cuffed and whimpering like cornered children. What once felt like a quiet suburban street now pulsed with the weight of truth breaking open. The investigation unfolded quickly. The uniforms the men wore were traced back to a cheap online vendor. Their badges were counterfeit, polished, to deceive but worthless against the scrutiny of law enforcement. And the worst part, they weren't strangers. Both men were directly tied to the HOA president, a longtime neighbor who had spearheaded complaint after complaint against Andre's family. It turned out this wasn't just about control over grass, height, or paint color. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered a web of HOA corruption, mismanaged funds, falsified fines, and targeted harassment that had disproportionately affected Black families in the community. Andre and Denise weren't the first to be targeted. They were just the first to fight back. As the truth spread, the neighborhood split. Some neighbors were horrified, ashamed they hadn't seen the pattern sooner. Others, those who had whispered, judged and watched with folded arms, now scrambled to distance themselves from the president they once supported. The HOA board dissolved under pressure, lawsuits followed, and within months the so-called leaders of Brookhaven Estates were facing charges of fraud and conspiracy. But the impact went far beyond legal battles. For Andre and Denise, the E1 night had left scars. Denise's cheek healed, but the memory of being struck in her own yard lingered. Their children, though shaken, saw something far greater than fear. They saw their father stand not just as a protector, but as a man who refused to bow to lies, intimidation, or violence. And slowly, neighbors began to change. Where there had once been suspicion, there was now recognition. Andre's story spread online, shared through the very cell phone videos recorded that night. Millions watched as a decorated Navy SEAL defended his wife and exposed corruption at the heart of a so-called perfect neighborhood. What began as an act of hate turned into a ripple of awareness, sparking conversations about power, prejudice, and the hidden injustices lurking in communities across America. In the end, Andre said little. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any speech could. By standing firm, by refusing to let corruption or racism break his family, he proved a truth that stretched beyond his street, beyond his town. Real strength isn't in uniforms, or badges or titles. It's in standing up when it matters most. And perhaps the question every neighbor, every viewer must now ask is this: